go. Okay, so the recording has started, and I will go ahead and share my screen so that we can get this up and running. Let's see, share that, and we'll go into presenter mode. Okay. Thank you all so much. Some of you have seen me before from the work that we did with when I was working with GeoElements and the Montecito post-fire assessment, and then the Montecito CWPP before that. So I really appreciate you asking me to come today and present to you. It's always an honor to, although I wish it could be in person. I'm currently living in Fresno, which, as you all are probably aware, is not nearly as nice as the coast. Pretty much any time of year, but especially this time of year. So today, what I wanted to do was address a question that a lot of people have been asking me over the last year, and particularly during the fall as we were in and then in the aftermath of the 2020 fire season, which was this question of, well, okay, this is obviously a disaster, right? How do we stop these disasters from happening? And it got me thinking about this basic question of, well, okay, was it a disaster? And is there a different way we can ask this question? Because part of what I have been working on really since starting to work with Montecito was I would say was the impetus for the question that I wanted to start asking was how we can better understand the drivers of fire disasters so that we can really focus on mitigating the disaster part and not trying to simply prevent fires anymore. And of course, Rob just talked about a bunch of concerns about trying to prevent ignitions. But statewide, there's a lot more going on. And so what I want to do today is talk about how we assess disasters and sort of start breaking them down so that we can better mitigate the disastrous part of fire and not focus as much on simply trying to stop all of them. Okay. And that requires asking sort of what are the drivers of fire activity? What are the things that we can do to distinguish between big wildfires and fire disasters, and then looking at future projections of fire in order to mitigate disasters. And as I said, this really started in my head when I was working with Montecito after the 2017 Thomas Fire, because one of the things that we found when we were doing the Thomas Fire retrospective was that, of course, you know, in many ways, the Thomas Fire was disastrous. There were over 1,000 homes lost. And of course, in the aftermath of the Thomas Fire, the fatal slides that occurred, the mud flows in Montecito killed 23 people additionally, right? And yes, it was a highly traumatic event for a lot of people, but we also wanted to highlight where there was some really positive outcomes, if at all, right, if those existed, in terms of what Montecito had been doing over the previous 20 years to try and mitigate some of those fire disasters. So what we found when we did this retrospective was that the work that Montecito had done in terms of the fuel treatments along roadsides, the sort of larger landscape scale fuel treatments, and the neighborhood chipping program really contributed to what turned out to be a positive outcome during the firefight itself. And when we initially looked at where those activities occurred on the landscape, if you haven't seen this map before in the Montecito work that we presented a couple years ago, this is where Montecito had actually implemented a lot of work across the landscape in an official capacity. And then when we actually looked at satellite imagery and asked, well, okay, where else did people do work in sort of the, well, my neighbor did something, so I should probably do something type of effect, right? And what we found was that there was an enormous amount of green space and fuel reduction that had happened or either existing grassy areas or actual fuel reduction that had been done around homes, all across the high part of the town, right, and right up against the national forest lands. And it created what we tended to call the green necklace up along the high roads. And that green necklace really helped save a lot of homes because in our discussions with Montecito personnel, it turned out, and with the individuals that were actually assigned to those divisions during the Thomas Fire, right, it ended up meaning that that was the places that they were able to safely work and catch the fire. The fire behavior died down in those areas because of the fuel treatments, and they were able to actually get in there and do fire following safely and contain the fire. And that the areas where there were sort of breaks in the necklace over on the left side here is where we had the largest loss of structures. So overall, what Montecito saw in 2017 was that despite a really a worst case scenario in so many ways, there were only 7 primary homes lost in Montecito during that event. And what we wanted to highlight when we did that retrospective report was, yes, it was a worst case scenario. We still had losses, but it was a fantastic outcome in terms of the work that they had been doing for 20 years paying off. And this was specifically the things that helped so that they can continue building on that for the future. So what I've done the last couple of years is started to think about that on a broader level. What were the things that they did? And really what we found was that they did all of these different things, both as individuals and in the community. And it really demonstrated a strong community partnership to try and facilitate the best possible outcome during that fire event. So bringing that idea forward to 2020, first, I want to ask what actually happened this year, because it was a very unusual, it was a record year in California, and there were a lot of unusual things that happened. First of all, we had an incredibly arid summer and early fall. And the map on the right here shows the vapor pressure deficit, which is essentially a measure of aridity. It's sort of how dry is the sponge that is the atmosphere. And for much of the southwestern US, including huge sections of California, this was the driest summer on record because of that combination of lack of precipitation and the incredibly hot conditions, right, that produce that dry condition. On top of that, we had some interesting events that happened, right? So we had a highly anomalous, once every 10 to 20 year lightning event that occurred over a multitude of days in the Bay Area and produced the ignitions that facilitated these large complexes around the Bay Area and north into the Mendocino National Forest. So those lightning ignitions, they were not unprecedented, but they're certainly unusual, particularly in conjunction with the very, very dry conditions. We had some wind events that really altered how many of these fires burned in certain ways. And those wind events, especially the dry east wind events that occurred later in the sort of September fire siege and into October, again, east winds not unprecedented. All of you live in Santa Ana and Sundowner country, so you're used to seeing east winds. But east winds at a time when you have such dry conditions really helped allow those fires to grow rapidly and explosively, right? And then, of course, all of this is occurring on top of a century of fire suppression and in many cases, a lot of dense fuels in the forests up and down the Sierra Nevada and then the North Coast. And then to top it all off, this year we had COVID. And as Rob noted, the number of people using the wildlands, using our national forests, our parks, all of these sort of open spaces this year was absolutely incredible. And the potential increase in ignitions from those individuals, we're still sort of working out what that looks like on the science side, right? But overall, there is a strong suggestion that this was a highly unusual year in terms of the number of human ignitions, likely potentially from COVID. Oops. Okay, so what happened in the Western US, right? We had record area burn in California, Colorado, and Oregon, record wildfire size in California. The August complex burned over 1 million acres this year up in Mendocino County. The top 3 largest fires in Colorado occurred this year. In California, or I'm sorry, in the West Wide, we had over 4 million hectares burned. That translates to about 10 million acres, right? And we had over 47 fatalities in the Western US this year, over 18,000 structures destroyed. And of course, even for people who weren't necessarily near a fire, there was so much smoke, it was ridiculous. There were a few days where almost the entire state of California was covered in smoke from the fires when we looked at the satellite imagery. And that was impacting even a lot of the urban areas like San Francisco and LA, where they normally just don't see a lot of smoke. And the media response, I like to think of it as the media freakout, because there's a lot of misinterpretation of what's going on sometimes in the media. This is a chart that CAL FIRE produced, showing at some point, in I think September, that so many of the largest fires had occurred this year during the 2020 fire season. This New York Times reporter misinterpreted the largest fires as the most destructive wildfires. That's not actually true, and we'll talk about the August complex more in that context. And we get a lot of the usual national media, the East Coast media, saying, "Well, okay, this was a hellish inferno. We've got all of this landscape torched by wildfire, right? This is unprecedented, and how this is really a unique disaster." And then in some places, of course, where we had unique events occurring, like in the Bay Area, where we had redwood areas burning that are part of state parks and are highly cherished by a lot of folks in the Bay Area, right? There was sort of this grieving for areas that people thought were lost to fire. And this is really part of a trend, because what we have seen over the last 30, 40 years is that climate change is increasing the amount of area that is burned by wildfires, very much due to that increasing aridity, that vapor pressure deficit that I talked about. This is a graphic produced from Abatsaglu and Williams 2016, which I kind of know the first author. I'm married to him. John Abatsaglu is my husband and a fire climatologist. So we work on stuff like this all the time. And what he and his colleague found were that, we basically had almost a doubling in wildfire area burned in the Western US over the last 30 years, specifically associated with anthropogenic climate change. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of bad things in 2020, but how was it actually a disaster? We need to actually really define this, because the only way to hone our mitigation efforts and really focus our limited resources on preventing disasters is to get at what is a disaster and how are fire seasons disastrous. So the definition of disaster is a sudden calamitous event bringing great damage, loss, or destruction. Okay, sure. And the key here is that disasters are really a human construct based on values. And what we do is we seek to preserve these values through mitigation of long-term disaster impacts, right? And that's this goal of trying to be resilient. And scientists love to study resilience and make up big words to go after this stuff. But basically, what we have looked at in the science side, and specifically in disaster geography. And I almost forgot to tell you what a pyrogeographer is, since Nick asked me to. It's pretty simple, actually. I'm a geographer by training. Geographers are, literally people who study Earth systems and how they're all complex. And so I study how fire functions in the Earth system. Really, it means that I get to go burn things and hang out with fire people, since I started out as a firefighter 20 years ago for the U.S. Forest Service. So it's allowed me to continue really working on a lot of different topics under fire. So So geographers have worked out these sort of concepts and these conceptual frameworks for how we build resilience to disasters. And so as a pyrogeographer, I am trying to look at how we can specifically build resilience to wildfire disasters. And so what we look at is, all right, there's a lot of different things that go into making a disaster, right? It's that this thing actually happens in the first place. So fires happen. In California, we have a lot of fires that happen, and they're going to keep happening. We've tried to stop them for, in California, 150 or 500 years, depending on if you go back to the Spanish Inquisition. The reality is that we cannot stop wildfires in California. As we saw this year, a huge proportion of the area burned by large fires was associated with lightning. And that is not something that we can stop. We've actually basically come to a point where we have been very successful preventing a huge proportion of ignitions. If we look at a 100-year trend of ignitions, we're way down. But we're always going to have humans that either intentionally set fires or that just make really uninformed or poor choices, right? And accidents happen. So we are not going to be able to stop them. So instead, what are the things that we can also look at to try and prevent disasters, right? So fires are going to happen. What are the things that we can do to mitigate fire behavior? That's our exposure piece. What are the populations that are likely to be impacted by this? Who is sensitive to fire? And COVID is providing us a great analogy for this right now, because the people that are the most sensitive, it turns out, to COVID are people in older age groups and that have some pre-existing conditions, right? Which is why those individuals are getting their vaccines first. Similarly, we have certain populations that are highly sensitive to wildfire. And then adaptive capacity, right? Your ability to build that resilience and bounce back after a fire. So understanding how these things work together to create disasters or allow people to survive and bounce back from disasters allows us to really focus on, all right, what are the things we need to do to help people live through a wildfire and then bounce back after it? Scientists, unfortunately, and in fire, have really focused on size. And, I am probably one of the few fire scientists you will ever meet who started out as a firefighter. So most fire scientists have not interacted much with fire on the ground. They've not interacted much with the stakeholder community, with fire managers and others. I see that Max Moritz is on the call. He's another individual who has actually done a lot of interaction with all of you, and I think has a much better grasp on sort of how fire actually works on the ground. But there's a lot of fire scientists that they sit behind a computer screen, and because size and fire area burned is this readily available metric, that's what they tend to focus on. And so, we see these graphics like, oh, look, in the last 40 years, we've seen this dramatic increase in area burned across the Western US. When we actually look back across the last century, that trend isn't quite so stark, right? Because we had an enormous amount of area burn in the Western US in the earlier part of the 20th century, before our fire suppression policies really kicked into high gear, and we built this national firefighting workforce. So that helps us put in perspective that, well, right, so size is relative, right? And it may not be the best metric. And it is one that has persisted because of some of the early events in the US related to wildfire, and specifically the 1910 fires in Idaho and Montana that really kicked off our national wildfire suppression policies, right? So, if you're not familiar with the 1910 fires, 3 million acres, 85 people dead. And at the time, it was just this absolutely immense event that, burned an enormous amount of timber at a time when the timber barons really wanted to come in and actually, extract that timber for enormous sums of money. But out of that, we get our national fire policies, that are trying to focus on minimizing those timber losses. And we also get, things like the Missoula Fire Lab and other Forest Service fire research agencies that say, okay, well, how do these things burn? How do they move across the landscape? How can we have a better understanding of fire danger? If you've ever seen the fire danger indices, this is the National Fire Danger Rating System flowchart that tells you all the things that go in and out. So we've built these really complex systems to describe fire danger, how fast it is, changing, and how we can actually measure and predict fire moving across the landscape. And so that's been the way that science has gone. But then there's this other side of fire science, and that's the fire ecology side of it, which basically finds that, through a variety of inquiries over the past half century, well, it turns out fire is pretty normal on the Earth's surface, right? Over 80% of the terrestrial surface of fire, or the terrestrial surface of Earth, is fire prone, has evolved with fire. And in many cases, much of the Earth needs fire, right? So that suggests to us that we've got kind of a tension here. We don't want fire because it causes disasters to humans, but ecosystems actually need fire, right? Size is also not a good indicator of disasters because some of our smallest fires have been our deadliest. In California, the 1933 Griffith Park fire up by LA, 29 men were killed, and that thing was only 47 acres. So, there's a highly disastrous but very small fire event. Much more recently, the 1991 Tunnel Oakland Hills fire, again, it's burned in the memory of people who lived in the Bay Area or fire personnel that worked that fire at the time. The thing was only 1,500 acres, right? And yet we had 25 people killed and nearly 3,000 homes consumed. So when we look at 2020 in California and ask ourselves, okay, well, yeah, there was a lot of big fires, right? And there were absolutely things that happened that were disastrous. So how do we start to drill down onto this, right? And we can look at numbers and say, yeah, okay, so it was a big year in California. We had, over 4 million acres burned on really several very large fires. One of the other things that we saw was that unusual places burned, right? As I noted before, the Redwoods burned. There was some giant sequoia areas that burned that I'll talk about in a minute. And we even had fires in the desert that burned Joshua trees, right? And these are unusual types of fire activity that are considered disastrous in many ways, right? But what I wanted to ask was, okay, well, so there's some obvious things that we already measure, right? And what I'm pointing out is that size is not always the best measure. So what are the things that actually matter to us that we can measure to try and describe disasters and then mitigate those disasters? And some of these are easy to measure. That's why we already measure them, right? We measure things like fatalities, suppression costs, the number of homes burned. For those of you that lived through the Thomas fire and dealt with it, there was for a while there no potable water, and you had a boil water order after the Thomas fire. And so you have across some of these large fire events in towns and whatnot, you have number of days without potable water, hazardous air quality days, right? All these things are immediate and really easy to measure. And that is why we often talk about disasters in that context. But then there's other things that we're not doing a good job of measuring right now that can help us improve our mitigation focus. So it's things like, well, okay, when we look at some of the direct and immediate impacts of fires, we have medical emergencies. So, there's been certainly quite a few heart attacks, fatalities associated with wildfires, people trying to evacuate and have a heart attack, people that go out of work for a while, and the potential for lost wages among some of the most marginalized members of our community. The number of school days lost for kids. This is something that people had not talked about before with fire, and now with COVID, it becomes a very stark, metric and evidence of the negative impacts of fire by having kids out of school. Um, when we look at some of the more prolonged impacts, right? Obviously, hydrologic and soil stability, as I mentioned on the 2017 Thomas Fire, that was the biggest fatality event was associated with the actual mud flow after the fire, right? So soil stability is something that we know is important. It's difficult to measure long term, right? Things like recreation access. In a year like this, the potential for lost ability to recreate was pretty substantial. And then looking at some of the really long-term things that are also hard to measure, we know that mental health is being severely impacted by prolonged wildfire seasons, right? Mental health among firefighters, mental health among individuals and communities that have been impacted long-term. PTSD has been huge. I've heard stories from individuals that had to evacuate from the 2017 wine country fires and then evacuate again in 2019 and then evacuate again in 2020. And their kids have severe PTSD. They think that they could have a fire burn down the house and kill them anytime now. So there's a lot of potential negatives. There's also some positives in here, right? And most of those positives are associated with ecological components. And healthy forests, healthy ecosystems are what help us prevent some of those negative impacts. So these two things are tied together. They're not necessarily two distinct sets, the negative and the positive. They're very much interconnected. Okay, so some case studies from this year that I want to talk about in a little bit more detail to illustrate this. I live in Fresno right now, which is really why I wish I could have came over to the coast for this. But the Creek Fire started over Labor Day weekend, just up the hill from us here, and it eventually grew to nearly 400,000 acres over a 2-month period. And there was some disastrous impacts from the Creek Fire. Initially, it made the news because there was that very dramatic airlift of all the individuals that were trapped up at Mammoth Pool, recreating over Labor Day. This had almost 1,000 structures destroyed, although it's important to remember that in the Sierra, many of those structures are outbuildings and not necessarily primary homes. Only almost 200 million in suppression costs, right? Luckily, they didn't have any fatalities. We had in the Fresno area, air quality was severely impacted from this fire and the SQF fire further to the south. And so for an area that already experiences horrible air quality nearly every winter and early spring from agriculture, we also had incredibly poor air quality in the fall at the time when we are usually able to get cleaner air in the city that basically has the worst air quality in the entire state. We also had on the Creek Fire, about 14,000 hectares of high severity fire, right? And high severity fire is problematic in the Sierra Nevada for a lot of reasons, including that there are places in the Sierra Nevada that we are ecologically projecting that we're going to permanently lose conifer forest because of the 5-year drought, killing off all the trees, and now the Creek Fire coming through. But there were also some benefits on the Creek Fire, and this was a really large fire. So across this fire, over half of the fire was either that was technically in the perimeter was actually either unburned entirely or it was just really low severity, and that is what this forest evolved with, was that low severity fire. We also saw the positive effects of a couple decades of good forest management from Southern California Edison and the Forest Service around the Shaver Lake area. And of course, Shaver Lake is one of the hydropower production facilities for Southern California Edison. And they've just done an amazing job with thinning and prescribed fire. And that allowed the town of Shaver Lake and the lake itself and its equipment for hydropower to be protected during this. And I consider that a really positive outcome because what they did worked, and it demonstrated that it can work, right? There's a lot of debate about what types of treatments will actually work in these high severity, rapidly changing because of climate change fires. And this worked during an extreme event. And for a lot of the fire on the Creek Fire, it was really first fire after a century of suppression. About 89% of the fire hadn't burned in the last century. Most of it was outside of the wildland urban interface, right? Over 96% was outside of the WUI. And this fire had no fatalities. So there were some really positive things that people are looking at the Creek Fire as a horrible disaster. And I think that there are some positives to focus on when we, acknowledge that there were disastrous impacts, mostly on the south end of this fire. But on the north end, a lot of it was actually beneficial fire. Right. So, yeah, this is, on the south end of fire, there was a community that was almost entirely burned down, a lot of dispersed homes. Again, this is an area that is, evolved with fire. This is black oak resprouting. Not even, there had been no rain yet, and this was already starting to resprout from reserves in the plant. And there was a lot of low severity, right? So you've got an enormous amount of area where there had been some clearing. They came in and took out a lot of the trees after the drought event that had died. And this fire did exactly what fire has done for millennia, which is, burn on the ground, kill a lot of the little small trees, and then leave the upper canopies untouched. And what's remarkable to me was that this was an extreme event from a fire danger perspective, right? As I mentioned, the Creek Fire started over Labor Day weekend, and it was record energy release component, right? ERC, one of our key fire danger indices, record ERCs across much of September and well into October. And despite those record ERCs, we still saw a lot of beneficial fire across the Creek Fire area, which is really sort of, in some ways, counter to this narrative that with climate change, we can't have beneficial fire anymore. So there was beneficial fire, even during this extreme environmental condition. And then, of course, there was a lot of smoke. And that's the downside of this, again, that we have an enormous amount of smoke impacting these areas. Another, potential thing that we can look at is a disaster metric for the 2020 fires, charismatic megaflora, right? All of you are familiar with charismatic megaflora because in my work in the South Coast, I've come to understand that there are a lot of people that really love Chaparral, and that is a charismatic megaflora for that region. But in the Bay Area, what we saw was large fires that were lightning ignited, right, and burned into these old redwood stands that had been relatively untouched for the last century. But here's the thing. Redwoods are fire adapted resprouters. So what I saw during the August and September fires in the Bay Area was people just crying over these redwoods. Oh, they're gone. I spent my childhood here. How awful is this? And they didn't understand that redwoods are fire adapted. They look really funny for a lot of years because they resprout from their bark. This is called epicormic resprouting, but they survive, and these redwoods will come back. This is actually from the Big Sur region from the 2008 Indians complex. And this was in 2013. These redwoods were hanging on and starting to grow back. Giant sequoia, on the other hand, are only adapted to low intensity surface fire. So in many parts of the Sierra Nevada fires this year, there was low intensity surface fire in the giant sequoia groves, and that will be beneficial to giant sequoia. They literally can't sprout new seedlings without surface fire. But unfortunately, part of the SQF complex burned several hundred giant sequoia trees all the way up into the crown, and that high severity fire will kill and did kill those giant sequoias. They are not adapted for that. So two sides of the coin, right? Again, positives and negatives. The August complex, of course, gained enormous notoriety when it passed 1 million acres in September or early October, I think it was. And the thing about that size is it made headlines all over the country. People started calling it a gigafire, which is technically not correct. I think giga would actually be something like 10 million or 100 million or even 1 billion acres. I forget what the order of magnitude is. So technically not correct, but boy, it sounded good on headlines. And the thing about the August complex is, yes, there was one fatality. There was an out-of-state firefighter that was killed in a rollover accident on that fire. Um, there were 935 structures lost, but those structures were lost in a tiny, tiny proportion of this fire, right? And in this map, those little green dots, that's the WUI. It was only less than 1%, a third of a percent of the fire area was WUI, and it was basically a couple little inholdings, and then this town at the north end of the fire, right? And so, what you have is really this huge tract of unburned area on the Mendocino National Forest that burned in this fire. And when we look at the fire history for this region, all of those sort of pink polygons are from the Cal Fire fire history data set, right? So there was a huge chunk of this landscape that hadn't burned in over a century, and that burned in this event, the August complex this year, and was what I think of as first fire, because it was the first re-entry of fire in a fire adapted, fire evolved landscape, right? And huge portions of this were wilderness. There was two large wilderness areas that would burn in this fire event. So, for when I'm trying to sugarcoat things and convince people that not all fire is bad, particularly in these more remote areas, one of the things that I like to talk about is, we really struggle to do fuel treatments and particularly prescribed burning across huge portions of the state. And obviously, it's a really different scenario in the South counties, for a whole variety of reasons. But in the Sierra and in the North counties, there's been this enormous struggle to reintroduce fire because fire suppression created such dense forests. It's really unsafe to go in and actually try and put fire in there. You have to do all sorts of fuel removal first and then put fire on the ground. And it's extraordinarily expensive. It's cost prohibitive in so many ways. And so one of the ways that I've started, thinking about this is, okay, can we acknowledge that having a fatality, having structures lost is absolutely disastrous and undesirable. But what we did get in this fire was about 1 million acres, right? The whole rest of the fire that was essentially treated with fire, with its natural disturbance, right? For the bargain price of only about $800 a hectare, right? Which translates to about $300 an acre. When was the last time you guys were able to do treatments in some of your units for $300 an acre? That because this fire cost $320 million to suppress. So that is it, it's an interesting thing to talk to people about this, because the immediate reaction is, oh no, but this was horrible, right? Because we had these losses. And I think what I'm trying to get across is that I think that we can acknowledge that what we want to do is not prevent million acre fires, but what we want to do is prevent fatalities. What we want to do is prevent structure loss. Is there a way that moving forward, we can acknowledge that, yeah, there was actually a lot of good fire across this huge event, and focus on protecting those towns through things like fuel treatments and prescribed gardens in very small areas, and through doing home hardening and all the things that we know work. Okay, so when people ask me, were the 2020 fires a disaster? And the number of journalists that ask me this, it's forced me to come up with sort of a stock answer, that I give almost every time. And I tell them, well, right, so that's actually the question I don't want to answer. That's the wrong question to ask me. The correct question is, what were the positive things that happened in 2020 that we can learn from to support and amplify resilience? And what were the things in 2020 that were really negative and disastrous, and that we can seek to mitigate to increase resilience, right? Because there was both disastrous outcomes and beneficial outcomes, and the disastrous outcomes are pretty clear, right? 47 fatalities across the Western US. In California, over 11,000 structures lost this year, which is the third highest total, and the three highest years, right, are all in the last 4 years, with the Camp Fire in 2018, and then the wine country fires and other fires in 2017, including Thomas Fire, right? And that we had a horrible hazardous air quality across huge sections of the state in August and September. And of course, suppression costs, right? The state, the feds are absolutely destroyed because of the suppression costs, especially combined with all the costs of COVID this year, right? It's decimating budgets everywhere. The economic losses this year are estimated to be well over $50 billion. That's a hard thing to actually calculate. And there was a period during the late summer and early fall where all 18 California national forests were closed for several weeks to all recreation, at a time when, because of COVID, the vast majority of the state really wants to be outside and they can't go to the national forest because fire danger is too high. So obviously that is a really disastrous outcome when you want your federal forests and public areas to be available to the citizens. And as I mentioned, a lot of these giant sequoias, these are really high value resources for a lot of folks in this state, and they're gone. We'll never see them again. I mean, these were hundreds to thousands of year old trees. So yeah, lives and homes lost, economic losses, irreplaceable items lost. There was a indigenous community up in the very northern part of the state where there was a lot of ceremonial and sort of sacred anthropological type artifacts that were lost. COVID was a problem in the fire camps and trying to figure out how to fight fires while also keeping all the firefighters safe. Hazardous air quality days, right? And there's a lot of things that we'll have to watch in the long term to see sort of what the long-term impacts are, things like chronic medical conditions that could come out from smoke exposure, permanent forest loss, how some of the vulnerable communities come through this. One of the things that we've seen is after the 2018 Camp Fire, there are a lot of people that have never moved back to Paradise, and they are sort of long-term refugees now. Some of them unfortunately moved to Oregon and were impacted by the fires in Oregon this year. We also learned yet again that mobile home parks are just fire magnets. They're tornado magnets in the Midwest, they're fire magnets here, and they are not made to withstand fire. So that is something that we're going to have to figure out how to mitigate moving forward. But net positive, we did see some things that were positive in 2020. We had great examples of how forest management and prescribed fire are allowing for communities to live with fire in the Sierra Nevada. And there was also a lot of managed wildfire in the Sierra and up in the north part of the state in the wilderness areas that we didn't really talk about. There was a lot of disaster to focus on, so we didn't really talk about that. But one of the things that happened this summer was that Yosemite National Park has a almost over 50-year, almost 60-year history of having managed wildfire, what we used to call let burn, right? And this year, despite the extreme conditions, despite the record temperatures, record dry conditions, they still had managed wildfire in Yosemite National Park. And this is the Blue Jay fire. It burned, I think it was about 6,000 acres, but it may have even been more than that, that burned for 3 or 4 months in Yosemite. And this was typical fire behavior for the Blue Jay fire, right? So despite this extreme climate change driven type of, temperature, precipitation, aridity, we're still able to have managed wildfire happen in a really positive way and supporting forest health. And the other thing that I've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence for, and I'm slowly collecting stories, is that there were a lot of places where defensible space worked this year. Communities that were built since 2006 when the new WUI requirements came into effect. And so a lot of the newer housing that was built since then withstood fire much better this year. There was a lot of places where communities had implemented, fire safe efforts, put in fuel treatments, and we're sort of slowly collecting a lot of this anecdotal data that says, yeah, you know what, this works. When we implement home hardening, when we implement defensible space, it works, and people are able to live with fire, evacuate temporarily, come back, and their home and property are still intact. We're also slowly seeing improvements in our ability to mitigate power line fires, right? And we just published a paper on public safety power shutoffs, which PG&E did a absolutely horrendous job with in 2019. And they're slowly making improvements. We saw fewer shutoffs this year, and we saw fewer power line fires. So I will take that as a net positive. Because they're learning and improving. We saw that some of these ecosystems that are fire evolved had positive fire. And as I noted with the August complex, the vast majority of fire across California this year removed a lot of hazardous fuels that have been sitting there for a really long time. And it may not be the way that we wanted that hazardous fuel buildup to be removed. But now what I ask, a lot of fire managers and folks that I'm talking to across the state is, okay, it's gone. Can we focus on moving forward and managing these forests in a healthier way? Can we use more prescribed fire there now because the hazardous buildup is gone? And can we look at those fires as places that are going to be somewhat immune to high severity fire for a short amount of time and use them as anchor points for, adjacent fuel treatments or adjacent prescribed fires? All right, so to wrap up, how do we mitigate for the future, right? Scientists tend to project future fire and area burned, right? So you probably see the headlines, you may see the studies if you're interested. Folks like my husband, for one, they put out these really horrendous projections that say, oh my God, the state's going to have twice as much fire by the end of the century, right? Don't focus on minimizing fire size, because the scientists, that's the only metric that they have to work with. Most of them don't understand fire any better. And so, they put out these projections of area burned, but what the management agencies and the stakeholders can focus on is trying to minimize disasters, not fire size. And it is going to be warmer, right? We are going to have more fire danger. For Santa Barbara, what we see is just an increase in heat across the rest of the century. I'm sorry, I know you all live along the coast because it's really nice weather, but it is going to get warmer and we are going to have extreme days, right? And we're going to have some warmer winters too, which of course also contribute to this increasing amount of wildfire we see in winter. And the thing that we can do is focus on preparing citizens and first responders, right? All of our fire agencies for longer fire seasons, more extreme fire behavior, and inadequate resource availability. And one of the things that Nick asked me to mention was this study that we just published with the lead author is a colleague of mine at Stanford. And what we looked at was this question of, okay, how frequently are we going to have both Northern California and Southern California burning at the same time, which is exactly what happened in 2018. The Camp Fire and the Woolsey Fire started the exact same day. So there was an inability to send resources between North and South as California has historically done, right? We had sort of a drawdown in both parts of the state at the same time. And so what we looked at was, okay, well, so how many days in autumn, what's our trend towards more extreme fire danger days, right? And this is the fire weather index. And we basically asked, all right, well, so if we take the historical 95th percentile fire weather index, as we move forward in time, what are the trends that we're seeing? So we're seeing that, basically we're getting more extreme fire weather days in autumn. And when we look at both Northern California and Southern California for future projections, right, what we see is that we've basically got a greater number of days when both Northern and Southern California have extreme fire danger. So what these two different lines are, the red and the blue, this is two different climate scenarios. RCP 4.5 is what we basically call the stabilization scenario, where the US actually cuts its emissions so that we're stabilized. RCP 8.5 is what we tend to call the more extreme scenario, where we don't do anything and we actually just keep increasing our emissions. That's meant to be the most extreme. Unfortunately, that's currently the path we're on. And so what we see is this much higher basically a 50% increase in number of days where both Northern and Southern California have extreme fire danger in the fall, under future climate. And when we look at this spatially, where are some of the areas that we have this sort of increase in fire danger, right? The most extreme, over 95th percentile fire danger days, right? And what we see is that, yeah, it's all those places that just burn like heck, right? And along the Sierra Nevada, the left side of this again is this sort of in 4.5 level emission scenario. The right side is the more extreme, or what we think of as the business as usual scenario. And what we see is that we've got this by the end of the century, in this lower right corner, this this period where we've got almost 3 weeks a year where where the entire Sierra Nevada, a huge portion of the northwest part of the state, parts of the Bay Area, and Southern California are all going to be having extreme fire danger at the same time. That really impacts the ability for the state fire suppression forces or fire prevention forces, right, to help protect people. Okay. So it's going to get bad, right? But the thing is, we have a lot of things that we can do, and this is one of my favorite pictures to show people from Montecito. I believe this is right above the San Ysidro Ranch, at San Ysidro Canyon in Montecito, and that's I believe that Carrie used to tell us it was called the White House. Everybody calls it around there, and this is the place where there had been an enormous amount of thinning of the chaparral and some work done leading up to the 2017 Thomas fire. And the day of the fire, it comes racing down this canyon, and on the right side of the screen, right, there's basically just a high severity fire effects, right? The chaparral is toast. Everything is toast. It's completely consumed down to mineral soil, and then it hits this area that is and remember, of course, this is under 60-mile-an-hour winds blowing downhill in that sundowner event. And then it hits this area where there had been an enormous amount of thinning and work done. And you can just see, as you look from right to left, you go from all the chaparral and the trees dead to green trees that are spaced out, to the area around the White House being completely protected, right? And then the lower part of this picture, right? So there's eucalyptus, there's oaks, there's all sorts of highly flammable stuff in the canyon, and yet that fire had died down enough by the time it moved into that, that it was safe to work in the suppression framework, right? And B, a lot of the assets that were just below this were protected. So, when people say, well, what do we do? We're just going to have these horrible fire danger days. We know that even under extreme conditions, mitigation activities work. And so really pushing for mitigation is not too late to start, right? And resilient landscapes, we know, are built on local partnerships. My work with Montecito led to the development of this sort of concept framework or concept graphic for, well, how can we live with fire? We talk about wanting people to live with fire. What does that look like, right? Living with fire means that we have fire, and that we focus on mitigating the worst effects of that fire and use every tool we have in the toolbox to mitigate different fire effects on different parts of the landscape, right? So focusing on protecting cities, mitigating the effects of smoke in urban areas, protecting water supplies, and when you get into rural areas, focusing on defensible space, community protection efforts, and then home hardening, and identifying, what we think of as places of relative safety, places where people can evacuate to. So all of these things, it's things that we know work, that all of you have seen, right, in your work in the county, and trying to get people to stop worrying about fire size and instead focusing on the specific activities that can mitigate fire disasters. Okay, so take home message. Size doesn't matter, right? I hope that's become clear by now that that's what I think. If it did, we should applaud this, because prior to European settlement, the West burned 20 to 30 million acres a year. 100 years ago, we were burning 20 to 30 million acres a year in the West, right? If we wanted to return to historical fire regimes, we would burn a heck of a lot, right? So we shouldn't focus on size. What we should focus on is trying to reduce the number of negative effects of a single fire and allow those positive effects to occur, right? And successfully reducing those fire disasters really requires successfully mitigating the negative impacts, not time to simply prevent all fires. And my new Smoky motto, I really need to get stickers made up so I can just put these all over the place where I see Smoky. That would be vandalism though, so I won't do that. Only you can prevent wildfire disasters, right? And we've gotten very good at preventing wildfires. Now we need to focus on preventing fire disasters by focusing on mitigation. And with that, I think I've run over my time a bit, Nick, sorry.
Outstanding, Crystal. We appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions?
This is John. I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a comment that folks that are in the fire service and were in the fire service don't need to be convinced about prescribed burns, because I went way back. I mean, in the 60s when we were just starting different ideas on prescribed burns. And I think the issue is mostly convincing the public, as you have, I'm sure you've done, as to the importance of doing just that. Great program, thank you.
You're welcome. And I wish I could say we've convinced the public that prescribed burns are important. That's not the case, right? There's a lot of pushback from certain areas for smoke, for concern about species that are imperiled, but smoke is really the big one, and of course the cost is really high. So it's I think an ongoing effort, and I'm trying to train the media. I always feel like when I talk to all of you, you already all know this, and you're teaching me these things, and I just really appreciate the interaction, the feedback I get. But yeah, we're trying to train the media because they're the ones that reach the public the most, I think.
So can I ask, is there any word on this, how the Creeks fire started? I know you're from Fresno, and that's my favorite part of the Sierras, the backpacking for years and years, and I was very concerned about it. Any word on the ignition?
I have not heard anything. Obviously, the rumor mill around here. I don't know how many of you knew or watched. They were utilizing Facebook for daily briefings. So I took to watching the daily briefings on Facebook from Joint Command. It was a really great effort that they made, and they have been very careful not to release any information, but of course the locals love to get on the Facebook pages and make all sorts of comments and speculate on those sorts of things. So we'll see if there is an acknowledged official cause when the investigation is done. I fear that might be one of the fires that they just sort of plug into the unknown category, which 60% of the fires that the state ends up recording, they plug into the unknown category. But yeah, certainly a lot of local speculation, nothing official.
I'm curious about how you see this being translated into communication to the public. This is really interesting and difficult information to communicate. And I, as a communicator, spent my career communicating hazards. I really am curious about what your thoughts are about how this information can be communicated best to the community.
That's a great question. Right. So I am one person, and I try and do as much as I can. There are a couple of things that that I try and focus on when I talk to my fellow scientists, who are also communicating, and when I talk to journalists, right? And the key thing is that if we only focus on sort of this idea that everything's getting worse, people feel helpless and they want to be able to do something. So when I talk to journalists and when I talk to my fellow scientists, what I suggest is that, you know, we focus on, yeah, okay, this is going to be bad. Let's not stick our heads in the sand, but that we really want to give people something that they can grab onto, that they can take action on, right? And I think that's part of the reason Montecito's program has been so successful. It gave people something to grab onto that they, you know, they could do. So, you know, it's a slow process. It took decades for people to have Smokey and Bambi ingrained in their heads, right? Only you can prevent fires. And now we're slowly turning the ship, right? It's the Titanic. We're slowly turning it, you know, trying to get people to view fire differently, but also acknowledging that, you know, where all of you are down there, it is still very much a prevention game because of the density of individuals, and trying to make sure that we don't have, you know, arsonists run rampant and things like that. So.
Well, I appreciate and impressed with your point of view. It's obviously a very different perspective than what we are normally associated with the media, and that was part of your point, but outstanding perspective. Thank you.
Right. I have a
Thank you
question.
all so much. Yeah.
I have a question, Doctor. So, and I'm gonna challenge you on size doesn't count for a second. In some major fires, such as the Zaca fire or the Thomas fire or the Creek fires that I was involved in all cases, where size really did cause a great impact was the fact that we didn't suppress those fires when they were smaller meant that their impacts down the road, weeks later, was so significant that they became disastrous when they had not been disastrous in the early phases. I mean, certainly the Thomas fire destroyed most of the homes in the first 1,000 acres. The other impact of size is the impact on the watershed. The hydrological impacts on the Thomas fire left us with watersheds that were contaminating, were tainting the water in our drinking water for a couple of years. On the Creek fire, the story is not over. The hydroelectric facilities in the San Joaquin drainage, depending on what kind of rains we see, could take out 20% of Southern California Edison's electrical supply. The water, the drinking water downstream in the valley, particularly for the poor communities that don't have alternative sources, it could make it so those folks don't have potable water for months even, and over maybe even a couple of years, depending what happens. So the impacts of big fires down the road is significant, both during the fire, but more so even in the coming winters that occur. So I leave it to you I'd love to hear your point on that.
Yeah, no, that is a great point, Robin, and I appreciate you bringing that up. It is, so what you are describing there, right? Those negative impacts, impacts on water supply, impacts on sort of the fire growing into areas that, you know, they do have more of they do get into the interface and things like that. Those are impacts not of the fire being large, but of it having a high enough severity, right? So I started my career after I got out of firefighting and went back to grad school. I started working on mapping burn severity. That was what sort of led me to this long train of looking at, all right, fires aren't just this binary thing, right? It's highly variable across the surface. And the thing with the Zaca fires, I'm not sure what could have been done with the Zaca fire, because that thing was just in such gnarly terrain that there's enormous challenges to trying to safely fight fire with a lot of the terrain issues. And I wasn't, I haven't done a retrospective on that, but a lot of these more recent fires where we're really concerned about watersheds, power supply, hydroelectric power supplies, and municipal water supplies. This is very much a concern born of high severity fire across that watershed, because if we have low severity fire, right? Or even mixed severity patchy fire, right? Even though it's really large, we're not going to see those negative impacts. And, you know, the creek fires, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in terms of an impact for sediment movement into those reservoirs, because a lot of that fire didn't actually burn at high severity. Right, across that map I showed of the creek fire, you know, over half of it was relatively low severity fire, and we don't actually expect a lot of soil movement from that because that organic layer is still relatively intact. So, you know, what is the what is the difference between size and severity, right, is what really matters. You can have a really large fire that doesn't have severe impacts. You can, if you have a lot of severity, have horrible impacts, right, as you've just described. And so when I talk about the mitigation, you know, if we have, right, and most in California, almost all of our water comes from these critical watersheds, right? Depending on where you're at, what part of the state. All of these burned areas are contributing to some sort of watershed impacts, right? For us in the Central Valley, I mean, I live in Fresno, we're ag central, and people are really worried about having water delivery to agriculture after the Creek Fire and the Esquiaf complex this year. And, you know, and it's a valid concern because if you get a lot of sediment running into the system, then you're going to have reduction in the water available for agriculture. The areas where they had done a lot of this forest management work, we're not going to see sediment runoff from that. And if the whole thing had been managed to be a healthy forest, right, it wouldn't matter that it's a 400,000 acre fire. We would have seen, you know, very little sediment runoff if it had been low severity fire across the whole thing. So what, you know, I understand your point. Yes, size does matter, because if we have a whole watershed burn and it burns at high severity, that's really problematic, right? But the problematic part is not that it burned, it's that it burned at high severity, you know, and it's all tied together, because if it's burning at high severity, that's where it becomes really difficult to manage. If it burns at low severity, there's a much greater likelihood that it's actually going to, you know, either go out on its own, or when it gets close to key resources, be able to suppress more easily when it's burning predominantly at low severity in a healthy forested system. So, you know, I take your point. Yes, size does matter when we're looking at the magnitude of some of these impacts, but it really, what I want to point out to people is that we can't really control the size, right? What we can control is how severely that is burning, and we can control that much more easily. You know, some of those wilderness fires that start and then are allowed to burn and then grow into larger fires. That was a huge concern in Oregon this year, is that some of the wilderness fires that had been not fully suppressed blew up. And that's going to be an ongoing conversation. I don't have the answer for that one. But, you know, again, it's sort of this question of, all right, what can we actually focus on mitigating? And it's hard to mitigate size. What we can mitigate is the actual impacts of those fires. But yeah, but I appreciate your comment, and that those are really important points.
This is Joan. I have a quick question if we have time. I really appreciate your presentation and the focusing on what we can do and the positives and how to reduce the adverse impacts. As you noted, Chaparral is much beloved here. And could you comment about how you manage or control burns in Chaparral? Because most of what I hear about is in forested situations, and I understand that a lot better.
Yeah. You know, the Chaparral system is incredibly challenging, in part because in Southern California, Chaparral has been impacted. You know, we talk about 100 years of fire suppression in the forested areas, right? Stemming from the sort of early 19th or late 19th, early 20th century fire policies that were implemented in the U.S. In Southern California, we've really got 500 years since the Spanish showed up and really started to alter this ecosystem, right? And because of the longevity of that impact and a lot of early information and records being lost. We don't actually, I mean, I think that there's disagreement from some of my fellow scientists on this, but, I don't think that we really have a good sense of how much burning some of the indigenous people in the region did, prior to the Spanish coming in and shutting burning down. It was one of their first, their first actions was to actually shut down cultural indigenous burning. And so there's this challenge with a system that obviously evolved to burn. There's a reason Chaparral is flammable, and it grows back immediately. I've been very impressed over the years going to fires in Southern California, and 2 or 3 weeks after a fire, no rainfall whatsoever, and the Chaparral and the chamise and the manzanita are already growing back like nobody's business. It's so impressive to me. They are so fire evolved. So there obviously was fire, contributing to that system for millennia. Today, what we see is that because of expansion of development, right, we've got huge swaths of the region that we've basically removed Chaparral from, and then also the frequency of fires in the last century, right, has really increased in certain places to the point where that Chaparral is now giving way to grasslands permanently, right? And this is some of the work that that John Keeley has done, and I think Max has done some work on this too. I can't remember actually, but there are a lot of places where that too frequent fire and the Santa Monica Mountains and sort of the area around Malibu is one of the hot spots, right? There are places around Malibu where they've burned, I think, 11 or 12 times in 80 years. It's absolutely amazing to me how frequently they burn. And those are places where that Chaparral is just, it's very responsive to fire. It does a great job growing back, but when you burn it too frequently, it's gone, right? So that does challenge sort of these ideas about what we can do to mitigate, some of the fire activity and fire behavior with things like prescribed burning. And that also sort of challenges, I think I most frequently describe it as this tension where we have a huge population in the South Coast. That huge population is, top priority for protecting, for saving lives, for supporting. But then you also have this ecological system that is very much under fire, right? A horrible pun, is very much being threatened by increasing fire frequency, by development into areas, right? And how do you manage those two things in concert, right? Protecting critical chaparral ecosystems while also making sure you protect people. And I don't know that there's a clear answer. I think in my mind, the clear answer is still focus on protecting people and homes through home hardening, through small, very tiny, the field treatments in a lot of those coast cities, they're really small. They're close into town, right? They're not giant fuel treatments in a lot of areas. They may look big on maps because the way the maps are made, but a lot of them are actually relatively small overall in size. And so focusing on really targeted fuel reduction to allow other areas to flourish. And I don't know that. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with Chaparral. I think it's a really problematic thing to look at a lot of areas that we're seeing burn more frequently, and that we may actually lose Chaparral on. And I don't know what the answer is to that. But it is certainly an ongoing concern that needs to be addressed in a way that still allows for homes, infrastructure, and lives, to be protected.
We used to use the term type conversion to what you're speaking about, and another area is pretty obvious is in the Santa Clarita Valley. A number of frequency fires over a period of time have done just that. Yeah,
no, and that's we made a map a couple of years ago of sort of where the fire frequency has been pretty high across the region, and particularly in, particularly under Santa Ana conditions, because that's when you get that incredibly high severity. And it is, the potential for type conversion, I think, is pretty high across a large area in the front country. And I always sort of look at it and go, okay, how do we do this? And I think the first step, right, if we're going to protect the chaparral, we have to protect the homes first, right? We have to protect the people first. And the way to do that is to really make huge efforts on defensible space on those private lands, home hardening, and really targeted fuel treatments along areas that are not great habitat anyway, right? Next to roadways. I love the roadside clearing programs that I see in Southern California, because that's not ideal habitat anyway. And it's a place where you can do the most good in a very small area. And yeah, you're going to end up type converting next to some of those roadways by continuing to clear them, but they're 6 foot, or the 6 feet on either side of the roadway for the clearance suggests that this is an area that is not great habitat to begin with. So it's the sort of ideal area to focus, really hyper focus some of those mitigation efforts on.
Well, thank you so much, Crystal. That's great, and look forward to putting this on our webpage. It should be there in the next couple of days, so if people want to share it with their fellow community members, that's great. And
I think I need to actually stop recording this, Nick. I'm sorry, because if I don't stop recording, it's not going to show up on your website.
I could edit it too to take the last portion out. But hopefully, if you're okay with it, we could invite you back next year, and you could keep us updated on the next fire season and what you guys are all doing at the UC system.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And I put my email on there at the end. Folks are always welcome to contact me. I'm happy to come down to Santa Barbara County anytime. It's an ongoing process to figure out how we can all live with fire in a region that is so incredibly fire prone. So, okay.
Thank you.